You're a bastard. And this family deserves better than a dying man's money, my wife announced to the entire table. 3 months earlier, I'd sat her down and told her I might have cancer, and she'd held my hand and promised we'd face it together. What I didn't know was she'd quietly increased my life insurance policy to $3 million the same week, then buried my treatable diagnosis for 11 weeks, hoping it would turn fatal before I found out. She had no idea my oncologist was about to live, that I was never going to die on her schedule. I'm glad you're here. Before this story unfolds, I need to ask, have you ever discovered someone you trusted wasn't who you thought? Drop a comment. Your answer might be the perspective someone else needs today. A quick note, some details here are fictionalized to strengthen the lesson. What matters is the truth it carries. 7 restaurants don't build themselves overnight. I'd learned that lesson one 16-hour shift at a time, starting with a single dining room on Westheimer Road that my father helped me lease when I was 29 years old. 38 years later, Langley's main restaurant anchored a small empire, 6 sister locations scattered across Greater Houston, each one carrying a piece of the reputation I'd spent my whole adult life carefully protecting. I was 67 now, and most mornings I still drove to Langley's before the prep cooks arrived, because some habits simply outlast the reasons you first started them. My father had run a much smaller operation, a single diner near the ship channel, feeding refinery workers coming off double shifts. Plates piled high because he understood something about hospitality that took me years to fully absorb myself. People remember how a place made them feel long after they forget what they ordered. He died the year before I opened Langley's. Never got to see the dining room I'd built in his honor, the framed photograph of his original diner that still hung by the host stand, a small tribute most customers walked past without noticing. I'd built an empire. Eventually. But I'd built it standing on the shoulders of a man who taught me that a restaurant was never really about the food. It was about who showed up and whether you made them feel like they mattered. I thought about him more than usual that spring, for reasons I didn't yet understand. Maybe it was turning 67, an age uncomfortably close to the one he'd been when the heart attack took him in his own kitchen. Apron still on, spatula still in hand. Maybe some part of me sensed, before the diagnosis made it explicit, that my own body was beginning to ask questions I'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Marlene used to come with me, back when the restaurants were young and we were younger. She'd sit at the corner booth with a legal pad, working out supplier contracts, while I argued with a walk-in cooler that never quite held temperature. 38 years of marriage teaches you the shape of a person. Or you think it does. I thought I knew Marlene the way I knew the floor plan of my own kitchens. I was wrong about both. Eventually, though, the kitchens forgave me faster. The cough started in February. The kind that lives in your chest and doesn't care what you tell it. I blamed the walk-in cooler's dust, the Houston pollen count, the fact that I was 67 and no longer built like the man who'd hauled sacks of flour up 3 flights of stairs. Saskia noticed before I admitted it to myself. She'd stopped by Langley's on a Tuesday with lunch for both of us, and she'd watched me try to swallow a cough between bites of brisket. "That's not allergies, Dad," she said. "That's been going on for weeks." "It's nothing, restaurant dust." "You've run this kitchen for 35 years. You know what restaurant dust sounds like. This isn't that." I didn't argue with her, because arguing with Saskia had never once worked in my favor. Not since she was 12 years old and decided she wanted to run the front of house instead of doing her homework. She'd inherited her mother's stubbornness and none of her mother's patience for pretending things were fine when they weren't. It was a trait I'd come to depend on more than I let her know. Corbin, when he heard about the cough secondhand from his sister, sent a text that read, "Probably nothing, you're tough, get some rest." I read it twice, looking for something underneath the words, and found nothing but the words themselves. That should have told me something. It didn't. Not yet. I made the appointment at Houston Methodist the following week. More to quiet Saskia than because I believed anything was wrong. Dr. Prescott's office fit me in on a Thursday morning, and I remember thinking, as I sat in the waiting room flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading, that I'd be back at Langley's by lunch service. I was already rehearsing the story I'd tell the kitchen staff, something about hypochondriac daughters and doctors who liked billing insurance for nothing. Dr. Prescott didn't laugh when I offered him that story. He listened to my chest for longer than felt necessary, made a note, and ordered a chest x-ray before I left the building. That should have been the second thing that told me something. It wasn't. Not yet, either. I still believed. The way people believe right up until the moment they can't anymore. That this was a formality standing between me and getting back to work. I drove back to Langley's afterward and buried myself in inventory counts. The way I'd always buried myself in the restaurants when something in my personal life felt too large to look at directly. There was comfort in a walk-in cooler that needed restocking, in a line cook who couldn't get his sauces to reduce properly, in the 1,000 small, manageable problems that made up a Tuesday. I'd built my whole life around the idea that work was a kind of medicine, that enough hours on your feet could outrun almost anything. I didn't yet understand that this particular problem wasn't the kind you could outrun. Marlene called that afternoon to ask how the appointment had gone, and I told her about the x-ray, the shadow, the word Dr. Prescott hadn't quite said out loud. She was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment, the kind of quiet I would later learn to recognize as calculation rather than concern, though at the time I read it simply as worry. The ordinary worry of a wife, hearing something frightening about her husband's lungs. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." I believed her. I want to be honest about that. Even now, even knowing everything I know, I believed her completely. The way you believe a person you've built 4 decades of Tuesdays with. The way trust becomes a kind of muscle memory that doesn't consult the rest of you before it responds. She sounded like my wife. She sounded like the woman who'd held my hand through my father's funeral, and both of our children's difficult births. I had no reason yet to hear anything else underneath the words. The x-ray showed a shadow. Dr. Prescott used the word shadow the way doctors do when they're not ready to use worse words yet, and he scheduled a biopsy for the following week, without quite meeting my eyes when he explained why. I drove home that afternoon with the kind of quiet dread that doesn't announce itself, just settles into the space behind your ribs and stays there. I told Marlene that evening, over a dinner she'd made without much enthusiasm. She'd never loved cooking, despite 38 years married to a man who'd built restaurants for a living. She set her fork down when I mentioned the shadow, and for a moment I saw something cross her face that looked, at the time, like fear for me. "A biopsy," she repeated. "When?" "Next Tuesday, Houston Methodist. I'll come with you." She did come, and she sat in the waiting room reading a magazine while they took the tissue sample, and she drove me home afterward, with one hand resting on my knee at every red light. I remember being grateful for that hand. I remember thinking, in the fog of local anesthetic and worry, that whatever this turned out to be, I wouldn't be facing it alone. I didn't know yet how much that thought would come to embarrass me. The biopsy results were supposed to come back in 5 to 7 business days. Dr. Prescott's office told me they'd call as soon as pathology finished the report. I gave them my cell number, my email, and because Marlene insisted it would be easier for coordinating appointments, her cell number too, listed as secondary contact. It seemed like a reasonable thing for a wife of 38 years to offer. I didn't think twice about it. I had no reason to. 5 business days passed. Then 7. Then 10. I called the office myself on a Friday afternoon, standing in the walk-in cooler at Langley's because it was the only quiet place in the building, and a receptionist named Dana told me the results had in fact come back, and that the file showed a family contact had already been notified. "When was that?" I asked. "I'd have to check with pathology directly for the exact date." but it's noted as handled. Handled how? I'm sorry, sir. I don't have those details in front of me. Would you like me to have someone call you back? Nobody called me back that week. I told myself it was a scheduling backlog, the kind of bureaucratic fog that swallows every large hospital system in America. I told myself Marlene had probably taken the call and simply forgotten to mention it, distracted by whatever Tuesday had thrown at her supplier calls. Garden club. The dozen small errands that filled her days. I believed the story I was telling myself because the alternative wasn't something I was ready to hold. I mentioned the delay to Marlene that Friday night, over a glass of wine on the back porch. The cicadas already starting their evening chorus the way they did every Houston summer. Still haven't heard back about the biopsy, I said. 10 days now. You'd think a cancer diagnosis would move a little faster than a car inspection. Hospitals, she said, shaking her head with what looked like sympathy. I'll call them Monday if you haven't heard anything. Sometimes they respond better to a second voice on the account. Would you? That'd be a relief. I've got the Riverside location's health inspection Monday, and I don't have the patience to sit on hold for 40 minutes. Of course, that's what I'm here for. I remember thinking, that evening, how lucky I was, not in any dramatic way. Just the quiet, unremarkable gratitude of a man who'd built a life with someone, willing to take burdens off his hands without being asked twice. I didn't know yet that "I'll call them Monday" was a promise she'd already broken 3 weeks in advance. That she'd been managing that particular phone line since before I'd even scheduled the biopsy. I raised my glass to her that night, toasting nothing in particular. Grateful for a partnership I didn't yet understand had already ended, at least on her end of it. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for 11 more weeks, was that Marlene had in fact taken that call. She'd taken all of them. I've had to piece together what happened next from documents I didn't see until much later. From a paralegal's timeline and a stack of intercepted mail that told a story I hadn't lived through in real time. But I know now that on the 5th of March, a nurse from Dr. Prescott's office called our home number and reached Marlene, who identified herself as my wife and primary family contact. The nurse read her the pathology findings, stage 2. Operable. Treatable with aggressive intervention. Urgent but not yet catastrophic. Marlene wrote something down. Then she made a decision that would define the next 11 weeks of my life. Though I wouldn't understand the shape of that decision until much later. She called the hospital back the following Monday and told them I had elected not to pursue treatment. She said I wanted no further contact regarding the diagnosis, that I found the whole subject too distressing, that all future communication should route through her as my designated representative. She cited a healthcare proxy on file, one I'd signed 7 years earlier, in a hospital bed recovering from kidney stone surgery, believing I was updating insurance beneficiaries. Nobody at the hospital questioned it. Why would they? A devoted wife of decades, handling her husband's affairs with what looked like tender competence. I think about that phone call more than almost anything else from that period. I think about Marlene's voice. The same voice that had said my name at our wedding, that had soothed our children through fevers and broken hearts, that had told me 1,000 small comforting lies about traffic and whether the roast was overcooked, using that same steady register to tell strangers that her dying husband didn't want to be saved. She wasn't planning my death carelessly. I understand that now. Though understanding it hasn't made it easier to carry. She'd been planning for years. In the quiet, accumulating way that patient people plan things, watching the restaurants grow in value, watching me get older, watching the actuarial tables tilt toward an ending that would leave her comfortable and unencumbered, provided nothing interrupted the timeline. A cancer diagnosis, left untreated long enough, was simply an efficient interruption to the marriage. She didn't have to do anything dramatic. She only had to make sure I never found out in time to fight back. Celeste Blackwell had worked the front desk at Langley's for 6 years by then, close enough to see the mail come and go. close enough to notice things she couldn't yet name. She told me later she remembered Marlene stopping by the restaurant office more often that spring, asking to help sort the mail before it reached my desk. Celeste hadn't known why. She'd only known it felt wrong. The way certain small dishonesties announce themselves before you have proof. She started keeping copies of things. She didn't tell me why for 4 more months. By the time she did, she'd built a case I hadn't known and needed, Celeste told me. Much later, exactly what had first made her suspicious. It wasn't Marlene's visits to the office themselves. Marlene had always dropped by occasionally, dropping off dry cleaning or checking on the reservation book during busy weeks. It was the specific request, made on a Tuesday in early March, that any mail addressed to me from Houston Methodist be set aside for Marlene personally, rather than placed with my regular correspondence. Celeste had asked, innocently enough, whether everything was all right. And Marlene had said something vague about wanting to help manage some paperwork so I wouldn't be overwhelmed. It was plausible. It was even kind-sounding, on its surface. But Celeste had watched her own father's second wife use almost identical language 8 years earlier, standing in a nursing home hallway, explaining to hospice staff why she alone should handle Frank Blackwell's remaining financial affairs. 3 weeks before he died, with $40,000 missing from an account he'd once shown Celeste the passbook for. Back when she was young enough to think passbooks were interesting. She started keeping copies that same week. Nothing dramatic, just a habit of running documents through the office copier before filing them. A habit she told herself was about organization rather than suspicion, even as some clearer-eyed part of her understood exactly what she was building toward. She never told anyone what she was doing, not even her husband, because she wasn't certain enough of what she suspected to risk being wrong about a woman who'd never given her any reason, beyond that one strange request, to doubt her. There was, I've since learned, a particular Tuesday in March when Marlene sat in our kitchen with a legal pad the same kind she'd once used to negotiate supplier contracts at that corner booth at Langley's, decades earlier, back when her planning had been in service of something we built together rather than something she was dismantling alone. She wrote out a timeline. Malcolm showed it to me eventually. Recovered from a search of her home office months later, dates for the lease amendment filing, a column for hospital contact ongoing, a note beside my name that simply read, "Monitor closely, don't overcorrect." I've stared at that legal pad more times than I can count, trying to find the moment the woman who wrote it stopped being the woman I married. I've never found it. I think, now, that there wasn't a single moment. I think it was a slow erosion, the kind that doesn't announce a start date, just eventually reveals how much ground is already gone. Brent Gallagher's name doesn't appear on that legal pad. Not directly, not that spring. But I know now he'd already been in the picture for the better part of a year by then. A man Marlene had met at a charity gala for the Houston Food Bank. Charming in the specific, practiced way of men who've learned exactly which questions make lonely women feel interesting. I didn't know about him yet. Sitting in my study that week, still trying to convince myself that 10 days of silence from a hospital was nothing more than paperwork moving slowly through a large bureaucracy. I only knew. In some part of myself I wasn't ready to examine that something had shifted in the rhythm of my marriage over the past year, and that I'd chosen, the way people choose not to ask the question that might have required an answer I couldn't live with. I want to tell this part carefully, because for a long time I blamed myself for not seeing it sooner. And I've had to learn that blaming yourself for another person's deception is its own kind of trap. Looking back, there were signs scattered across that entire year before the diagnosis. Signs that only resolved into a pattern once I had the full timeline to measure them against. There was the Thursday, back in the fall, when Marlene had come home smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine, and I'd made a joke about her hugging too many people at the Garden Club fundraiser. And she'd laughed and agreed, And the moment had passed without either of us examining it further. There was the new phone she'd bought that January, replacing one that worked perfectly fine. And the way she'd started taking it into the bathroom when it rang instead of answering in front of me the way she always had. There was a credit card statement I'd glanced at and not really seen. A charge for a hotel in Galveston on a Tuesday, when she'd told me she was visiting her sister in San Antonio. None of it had seemed like evidence at the time. Each individual thread looked in isolation, like the ordinary texture of a long marriage, small privacies, small omissions. The kind of things you stop noticing after enough decades of trusting someone completely. It was only after the diagnosis, after Malcolm's investigator started pulling records, that I understood how many of those threads led to the same place a man named Brent Gallagher, a real estate developer, 11 years younger than Marlene, whom she'd apparently been seeing since sometime the previous spring. I didn't learn his name until much later, from Malcolm rather than from Marlene herself, who never once volunteered the truth about him, even after everything else had come apart. But I've had time since then to understand the shape of what he offered her attention without the weight of 38 years of shared history. Excitement without the exhaustion of watching a husband's health decline. A version of her own future that didn't involve nursing an aging man through chemotherapy and hospital waiting rooms. I don't think she set out that spring to become a woman capable of hiding a cancer diagnosis from her husband. I think she found herself standing at a fork in a road she'd been walking toward for over a year. And she chose the path that led toward Brent Gallagher and a beach house, rather than the one that led toward growing old beside a sick man she'd already, in some private accounting I never saw, decided leave. Saskia's 28th birthday fell that same week. A small dinner at her apartment that I almost canceled given everything else pressing on my mind. I'm glad I didn't. She'd made her grandmother's brisket recipe. My mother's recipe, actually. Passed down through 3 generations of Hayward women, who'd married into a family that measured love partly through what it fed people, and the apartment smelled like every Sunday of my childhood when I walked in. You didn't have to do all this, I told her, setting down a bottle of wine I probably shouldn't have opened, given the biopsy still hanging unexplained over both of us. You taught me that food is how this family says the things we're bad at saying out loud. I figured tonight needed some saying. She handed me a plate before I could argue further. The brisket falling apart the way it was supposed to. Seasoned exactly the way my mother used to season it. Besides, Corbin canceled, said work got dizzy. I didn't push on that. Corbin's cancellations had become common enough over the past year that I'd stopped expecting otherwise, though each one still landed with a small, familiar disappointment I'd learned not to voice. Saskia noticed anyway. She noticed most things about our family that I tried not to say out loud. He used to come to everything, she said. Not quite a question, watching me over her wine glass. What happened? I don't know. Life, maybe. People get busy. Dad, she set her glass down with the particular firmness she'd inherited from somewhere neither of us could name. I'm not 12. You don't have to protect me from noticing that my brother's been drifting for a couple of years now. I've noticed. I just don't know what pulled him that direction. I didn't have an answer for her that night. Sitting in her small kitchen with brisket that tasted like every good memory I had of being a father. Wondering, not for the first time, though I didn't yet understand how urgently the question would matter in a few months. What exactly had been quietly reshaping my son while I'd been too busy running 7 restaurants to watch closely enough? 3 weeks became a habit I didn't recognize as a habit. I kept expecting a callback that never came. Kept assuming the silence was hospital bureaucracy rather than a wife's deliberate architecture. What finally cracked the fog wasn't a phone call. It was a scheduling conflict. I'd asked Malcolm, my attorney of 15 years, to review the restaurant lease renewal that was coming up that summer, a routine matter I'd handled a dozen times before. Malcolm called me on a Wednesday afternoon, his voice carrying an edge I wasn't used to hearing from him. Otis? When did you add a co-ownership clause to the Langley's lease? I didn't. I've never added anyone to that lease. There's an amendment here from 3 years ago, filed under signature, using power of attorney granted through a healthcare proxy dated 2018. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, trying to make the words mean something other than what they clearly meant. I signed a healthcare proxy in 2018, when I had the kidney stone surgery. It was supposed to be for medical decisions. This amendment uses it to grant co-ownership of the restaurant property to Marlene Hayward. I need you to come to my office. Today, if you can. I remember driving to Malcolm's office with my hands too tight on the wheel, replaying every document Marlene had ever placed in front of me during that hospital stay. I'd been on pain medication, exhausted, trusting the woman I'd built a life with to handle the paperwork while I recovered. She'd told me it was insurance updates. I'd signed without reading closely, the way you trust your spouse of 3 decades to not need close reading. That hospital stay came back to me in pieces on the drive across town. The particular disorientation of the days after surgery. Painkillers thinning the edges of everything. Marlene's voice, a steady, comforting constant, while nurses came and went and machines beeped their quiet reassurances. She'd brought a folder to my bedside on the 3rd day, if memory served. Sitting in the vinyl chair beside my bed with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. Walking me through pages I remember signing without really seeing. Just the beneficiary updates we talked about, she'd said. Or something close to it. And a healthcare proxy, in case anything like this happens again, and I need to make decisions quickly. It had seemed at the time like exactly the kind of practical foresight I'd always loved about her. Marlene 3 steps ahead of a problem before it fully arrived. Handling logistics, so I didn't have to. I hadn't questioned any of it. Why would I have? I was recovering from surgery, groggy and grateful for a wife who seemed to be managing everything so I could focus on healing. It never once occurred to me. Signing papers I only half registered. That the woman reading them to me might be describing something other than what was actually printed on the page. Malcolm laid the documents out for me that afternoon. And for the first time I saw, in black and white, language I'd never agreed to. The proxy authorized medical decisions. That much was legitimate. But somewhere between the hospital and the county recorder's office, additional language had been appended. Language that extended the proxy's authority to business and property matters requiring the principal's incapacity or unavailability for decision-making. I hadn't been incapacitated. I hadn't been unavailable. I'd been recovering from a routine surgery, trusting my wife to bring me forms that matched what she told me they were. This doesn't happen by accident, Malcolm said, watching my face carefully. Someone drafted this language deliberately, and someone filed it with the county 3 days after your surgery, while you were still on painkillers strong enough that you likely don't remember signing half of what you signed that week. I didn't remember. That was the worst part. Not the betrayal itself, but the realization that I couldn't even reconstruct what I had and hadn't agreed to. Because Marlene had chosen the 1 week of our marriage when my judgment was least reliable to make her move. Malcolm walked me through the mechanics of it, patiently. The way he'd walked countless clients through complicated fraud before. A healthcare proxy in Texas gives someone authority over medical decisions when you're incapacitated. It doesn't automatically extend to business or property matters that requires a separate power of attorney, executed with its own formalities. What someone did here was take a legitimate medical document and graft business language onto it after the fact, banking on the fact that most people never read their own healthcare paperwork closely enough to notice a few added clauses. How does something like that even get filed? Doesn't the county check these things? Not the way you'd hope. County recorders verify that a document meets formatting requirements, proper notarization, correct forms. They don't verify the substance of what's being claimed. And they certainly don't call the person named in the document to confirm they understood what they were signing. Fur like this relies entirely on nobody looking closely until it's too late to easily undo. And if I hadn't caught it? If the lease renewal hadn't come up? Malcolm was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Then the co-ownership clause would have stood, probably indefinitely, until you tried to sell the property or pass it to your children, at which point it would have surfaced as a significant complication, likely after you were no longer in a position to easily contest it. He didn't say the rest of that sentence out loud, but I understood it anyway, after you were dead, or too sick to fight. Which amounted to the same practical outcome from where Marlene appeared to have been standing. I need you to think carefully, Malcolm continued. Has anything else felt off financial statements you haven't seen mail that seems to be missing? I thought about the biopsy results that had never reached me. I thought about the silence from Houston Methodist, standing in Malcolm's office, still not knowing the full shape of what Marlene had done. I felt the first cold thread of a suspicion I wasn't ready to follow to its end. Malcolm pulled the original 2018 proxy from a manila folder and set it beside the altered version, side by side, so I could see the difference for myself. The signature matched. That was the strange part. My own hand, my own careful, looping capital letters, undeniably mine. What didn't match was everything beneath it. 3 additional clauses in a font close enough to the original that a casual reader would never notice the seam, but different enough, under Malcolm's magnifying glass, that a forensic document examiner would spot it in minutes. This is the kind of forgery that requires patience, Malcolm said. Not a rush job. Someone took their time matching the formatting, matching the margins. Probably scanned the original page and rebuilt it around your real signature rather than trying to forge the signature itself. That tells me something about who we're dealing with. This wasn't panic. This was planning. Marlene doesn't have that kind of technical skill. She barely uses the printer at home. She doesn't need the skill herself. She needs access to someone who does, or enough money to hire someone who does. And 11 years married to a man who owns 7 restaurants, generating enough cash flow to make either of those things easy to arrange quietly. He closed the folder. I'm not accusing her of anything yet. Otis, I'm telling you what the document tells us. The rest we build with evidence. I left his office that afternoon with a headache behind my eyes that had nothing to do with the diagnosis I still didn't officially have, and everything to do with trying to hold 2 versions of my wife in my head at the same time. The one who'd brought me soup during every flu season for 38 years, and the one apparently capable of commissioning a forged legal document while I recovered from surgery 3 feet away from her. Saskia found me that evening sitting in my car in the restaurant parking lot, engine off, staring at nothing. She'd come by to drop off paperwork for the catering side of the business and found my truck still there 2 hours after closing. Dad, she knocked on the window. What's going on? I told her about the lease, about the proxy, about language I'd never agreed to appended to a document signed while I was too drugged to read carefully. She listened with the particular stillness she'd inherited from nowhere I could identify. Not from me, not from Marlene. Just some private reserve of calm that surfaced whenever the people around her needed steadiness. And the biopsy results, she said, when I'd finished. Dad, it's been almost 2 months. Have you called them back? I called. They said it was handled. Handled by who? I didn't have an answer, and watching me not have an answer seemed to settle something in Saskia's expression. A decision forming behind her eyes that I wouldn't fully understand until much later. She drove to Houston Methodist herself the next morning, before her shift at the restaurant, and asked to speak with someone in medical records. They wouldn't release information to her without my authorization present, which was reasonable, HIPAA being what it was. But she came away with one piece of information that mattered the file. Showed contact from a family representative as recently as 3 weeks earlier. Someone had been actively managing my case. Someone who wasn't me. She called me from the hospital parking lot, and I could hear something in her voice I rarely heard from my daughter. Fear. Carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Dad, I think you need to go to a different hospital. Get a second opinion somewhere Mom hasn't been talking to anyone. You think your mother? I don't know what I think yet, but someone's been managing your file for weeks, and it isn't you. And I don't like the only other name on our insurance paperwork. That night, unable to sleep, I thought about the small silences of the past 2 months. Marlene taking calls in the other room. Marlene volunteering to sort the restaurant mail before it reached my desk. Marlene's sudden interest in the health of my kidneys and my liver and my general prognosis. Frame always as concern rather than curiosity. I'd read all of it as love. I was starting to wonder if I'd been reading it wrong. I found Saskia in the kitchen the next morning, before either of us had to be anywhere. And I asked her the question I hadn't been able to ask anyone else yet. Do you think your mother is capable of this? Of actually hurting me on purpose? She considered the question with the same careful seriousness she brought to everything, not rushing to comfort me with an easy answer. I think moms spent our whole lives being very good at deciding what other people needed to know. And when. Remember when Grandma Ruth was sick? And Mom decided none of us should visit the last 2 weeks because she didn't want us to remember her that way. She made that decision for the whole family. Nobody voted on it. That's different. That was protecting people from a hard memory. Was it protecting us? Or was it Mom deciding she knew better than everyone else what we could handle? Saskia poured herself coffee, not quite looking at me. I loved Grandma Ruth. I wanted to say goodbye. Mom decided for me that I didn't need to. I've never fully forgiven her for that, if I'm honest. Even though I understood why she thought she was doing the right thing. I hadn't thought about that old decision in years, but hearing Saskia name it now, in the specific light of everything else that had happened, I felt something shift in my understanding of my wife. Not new information exactly, but old information finally being read correctly for the first time. Marlene had always believed she knew best. She'd always been willing to make decisions on other people's behalf, quietly, without consultation, trying her own judgment over anyone else's right to choose for themselves. I'd spent 38 years calling that quality decisiveness. I was beginning to understand it might have always been something closer to control. Saskia didn't wait for me to make a plan. 2 days later, she withdrew $9,000 from her 401k money she'd been saving toward a down payment on her first house and told me she was taking me to Austin for a second opinion at Dell Medical School, a hospital system with no history of ever hearing from Marlene Hayward. I tried to refuse the money. She wouldn't hear it. You'd do the same for me, she said. You have done the same for me. Let me do this. I thought about all the ways she was right, and about how little I liked being on the receiving end of that particular truth. When Saskia was 23 and struggling to open her first small catering venture, I'd co-signed a loan without a second thought, because that's what fathers who could afford it did for daughters trying to build something of their own. I'd never once considered it a debt she owed me. Watching her now, jaw set, already pulling up flight schedules on her phone before I'd even agreed to go, I understood that she'd never considered her $9,000 a debt either. She considered it the ordinary math of family. You give what you can when it's needed, and you don't keep score. It was a math Corbin I was beginning to realize, had never quite learned the same way. I don't want you going into debt over this, I told her. I'm not going into debt. I'm using money I saved for a house I'm not buying yet anyway. Dad, you spent 35 years building something that fed half this city. Let someone feed you back for once. I didn't have an answer for that. I let her book the flights, I thought, watching her scroll through departure times with the same practical focus she brought to running her side of the catering business, about the particular kind of person my daughter had become. Not through anything I'd deliberately taught her, but through some combination of temperament and the ordinary example of watching her parents run restaurants together for most of her childhood. Saskia had grown up understanding that care was something you demonstrated rather than announced, that showing up mattered more than saying the right words at the right moment. She'd learned that from watching me show up at 4 in the morning for delivery trucks, from watching me stay late during health inspections, from 1,000 small, unglamorous acts of responsibility she'd absorbed without either of us ever naming it as a lesson. I wondered, not for the first time that week, whether Corbin had learned something different from the same household. Some quieter lesson about what mattered that I hadn't intended to teach, but had apparently taught anyway. I didn't have an answer for that either. Sitting in my study while my daughter booked flights to save my life on a moment's notice. But the question sat with me uncomfortably. The way unresolved things do. Waiting for enough evidence to finally resolve into an answer I wouldn't like. Corbin called that same week, and I let myself hope, briefly, that my son had heard something was wrong and wanted to help the way his sister had. I answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad, Mom mentioned you weren't feeling great. I've had some tests done. Nothing confirmed yet." That's good. Hey, listen. Mom mentioned she's looking at a property out toward Galveston. Some beach house thing. You know anything about the numbers on that waterfront? Supposed to be a good investment right now. Interest rates being what they are. I sat with the phone against my ear, waiting for the rest of the sentence. The part where he asked how I was actually doing, whether the tests had been painful, whether I was scared. The rest of the sentence never came. He talked for another 4 minutes about property values and market timing and whether I thought Marlene should make an offer before summer. And at no point did he ask me a single question about my health that wasn't already answered by, "Nothing confirmed yet." I told myself he was young. 31 wasn't young, not really. But I told myself that anyway, and that men in my family had never been good at talking about illness, myself included. I told myself he processed fear by focusing on something he could control, like property values, rather than something he couldn't, like his father's lungs. I made excuses for him the way parents do, cataloging reasons rather than patterns. But I noticed. And noticing is its own kind of knowledge, even when you refuse to act on it yet. I noticed that Saskia had emptied her retirement savings without being asked. And Corbin had asked about waterfront real estate without being asked either, each of them revealing, in their own uninvited way, exactly what mattered to them when their father's mortality entered the conversation. I asked him to come by the house that Sunday instead of continuing the conversation over the phone. And to my mild surprise, he agreed. He arrived a half hour late, the way he'd arrived late to most things since college. And I made us both coffee while he checked his phone twice at the kitchen table before I'd even finished pouring. "So, what's going on with the tests?" he asked, finally setting the phone face down, which from Corbin counted as full attention. Biopsy came back. It's cancer, stage 2. According to what I've pieced together, though I haven't gotten a formal treatment plan yet. I watched his face for a reaction, and got one, a flinch, quick and genuine. The first unguarded thing I'd seen from him in months. "Dad, I'm sorry. That's serious." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. "What do the doctors say about treatment? Timeline, prognosis, all that?" "That's actually part of the problem. I haven't been able to get a straight answer out of anyone at Houston Methodist. Somewhere between the biopsy and now, there's been some kind of mix-up with my file." "What kind of mix-up?" "I don't know yet. I'm working on finding out." I hadn't decided. Sitting across from him that Sunday, how much to say about my suspicions regarding Marlene, not until I had proof. Not until Malcolm had something more solid than a forged proxy and a bad feeling. "How are things with you? Work still busy?" "Yeah, the Henderson deal's finally closing next month. Should be a good commission." He hesitated, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Mom mentioned you two have been arguing more than usual lately." "Your mother said that." "Just that things seemed tense. She didn't go into details." He shrugged. The particular shrug of a man who'd decided not to ask a follow-up question he suspected he wouldn't like the answer to. I figured it was stress, with the health stuff and everything. I studied my son across that kitchen table, searching for some sign that he wanted to know more, that he'd push past the surface the way Saskia always did, the way I'd have pushed at his age, if my own father had told me he was sick and something strange was happening with his medical care. The push never came. He finished his coffee, checked his phone again, and left 40 minutes after he'd arrived, promising to call more often. A promise I recognized even then as the kind people make when they mean it in the moment, and forget it by the time they reach their car. I didn't say any of this to anyone else that week. I sat in my study for a long time, looking at photographs on the wall. Corbin at his college graduation. Saskia at her culinary certification ceremony. The four of us at Christmas a decade earlier. Before any of this, when I still believed family was a fact rather than a choice people made and remade every day. I didn't yet know how right that instinct would turn out to be. I only knew sitting there that something in our family had shifted onto ground I couldn't see clearly yet, and that I needed answers before I could trust my own footing again. Corbin hadn't always been like this. I want to be fair to the man he used to be, even now. Even knowing where his choices eventually led him. He'd worked the line at Langley's for 2 summers during college, sweating over the same flat-top grill I'd sweated over at his age. And he'd been good at it. Quick hands, a decent palate, the kind of instinct for a kitchen's rhythm that couldn't be taught. I'd let myself imagine back then that he might eventually take over the business the way I once imagined it. The two of us building on what my father had started. Somewhere between his college graduation and his 31st birthday, that version of my son had quietly stepped aside for a different one, sharper about money, softer about everything money couldn't buy, more comfortable asking about property values than asking about pain. I don't know exactly when the shift happened, or whether it was even a shift so much as a slow unveiling of something that had always been there, waiting for the right pressure to reveal it. What I knew. Sitting in my study with the phone still warm in my hand from his call, was that my son had just spent 4 minutes asking about waterfront real estate while his father sat across town with an unconfirmed shadow on an X-ray, and that the silence where his concern should have been told me something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet, even to myself. I drove out to the Riverside location that Saturday, partly for the health inspection Marlene had offered to help me dodge, and partly because I needed a few hours inside a kitchen that hadn't changed shape underneath me the way everything else had. My general manager there, a steady man named Wallace, who'd been with me almost as long as Celeste, noticed something in my face he didn't usually see. "You all right? Otis, you look like a man who found a rat in his walk-in." Something like that. I didn't elaborate. And Wallace, being the kind of man who understood the difference between curiosity and respect, didn't push. But he mentioned, almost as an aside while we walked the line together, that Marlene had stopped by the Riverside office twice that month, asking to review the location's financials, something she'd never shown interest in during all our years together. Restaurant paperwork having always been my domain and mine alone. She say why? Said she was thinking about getting more involved in the business side of things. Seemed reasonable enough at the time. Wallace paused, reading something in my expression. Wasn't it reasonable? I didn't answer him directly, but I made a note in the small jacket notebook Malcolm had asked me to keep. Another data point in a pattern I was only beginning to see the outline of. Marlene reviewing financials at a location she'd shown zero interest in for 30 years. During the exact window when a forged lease amendment had granted her co-ownership rights she'd never legally been given. It wasn't proof of anything on its own, but it was one more thread pulling the same direction as all the others. And by that point I'd stopped believing in coincidence. I stayed late at Riverside that evening, longer than the inspection required. Working the line alongside Wallace's crew the way I used to work every station personally during the restaurant's first decade. There was something steadying about the heat of a flat-top grill, the rhythm of tickets coming in, the particular focus a busy dinner service demanded that left no room for thinking about anything beyond the next plate. I'd built 7 restaurants, partly because I loved feeding people, and partly I was starting to understand that evening. Because a kitchen was the one place in my life where the rules had always been clear and the outcomes had always been fair. Cook something well, and it turns out well. Cut a corner, and the dish suffers, predictably, immediately, without any 38-year delay between the choice and its consequence. I drove home past 10 that night, exhausted in the specific, satisfying way that comes from physical work rather than emotional strain, and found the house dark. Marlene already asleep, or pretending to be. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment, watching the shape of her under the covers, trying to reconcile the woman breathing steadily in that bed with the woman apparently reviewing restaurant financials she had no legal claim to, apparently managing a phone line to a cancer hospital I knew nothing about. I didn't wake her. I didn't yet have anything to say that wouldn't tip my hand before Malcolm and I were ready. I went to bed in the guest room instead, telling myself it was to avoid disturbing her sleep. Know somewhere underneath that convenient explanation that I simply couldn't lie beside her yet without asking questions I wasn't ready to ask. Austin was 2 hours west, and felt that morning like traveling to another country. Saskia drove the whole way, her hands steady on the wheel in a way mine hadn't been in weeks, and neither of us talked much past the outskirts of Houston. I watched the highway unspool past ranchland and billboards, thinking about a silence I still didn't understand, not yet knowing how long it had actually lasted. The records coordinator at Dell Medical School was a young woman named Priya, patient and thorough in a way that made me grateful before I had any reason to be. She pulled up my information, cross-referenced it against Houston Methodist's system with my authorization, and then paused in a way that made Saskia sit up straighter beside me. "I'm so sorry for the delay," Priya said. "Houston Methodist wouldn't release your pathology reports without additional verification. There's a note here that your family representative already called them directly and indicated you'd declined treatment and requested no further contact regarding the diagnosis." The room tilted. That's the only way I can describe it. Not dramatically, not with sound effects. Just a slow list to one side, like a boat taking on water it hadn't announced. "I never made that call," I said. "I've never spoken to anyone at that hospital except my own doctor." Priya checked her notes again, her expression shifting from professional patience to something more careful. "The contact is listed as Marlene Hayward, noted as spouse and designated healthcare proxy. The call is dated," she scrolled, "3 weeks ago, though there are earlier notations suggesting contact going back to early March." Saskia had gone pale beside me, her jaw tight in a way I recognized from her childhood, the look she got right before she stopped being patient with something. I felt the floor of my understanding give way entirely. 3 weeks, Priya had said. Marlene had known for 3 weeks, known enough to call a hospital and lie about my wishes. Known enough to manage a fiction that kept me in the dark while she decided, apparently, what to do with the knowledge. "Can you tell me what the pathology results actually said?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Pia could, with my authorization sitting right there in the room, and she read them to me clearly. Stage 2, operable. Aggressive treatment recommended. Urgently. With a strong prognosis if intervention began promptly. Every week of delay narrowed that window incrementally. I did the math without wanting to. March to now was closing in on 11 weeks. "I'd never called anyone," I said again, mostly to myself. "I'd never seen the results." Saskia's hand found mine on the armrest between us, and she held it the way she'd held it in every waiting room of my life since she'd turned 18 and started showing up to things I hadn't asked her to attend. "We're going to fix this," she said. "Starting today." Priya printed the full pathology report for me before we left, along with a timeline of every contact attempt Dell Medical had made trying to coordinate with Houston Methodist over the preceding weeks. I sat in the parking garage afterward, engine off, reading through pages of dates and initials and the clinical shorthand doctors use to keep urgency at arm's length. And somewhere on the third page I found the entry that made the whole 11 weeks click into a shape I couldn't unsee. A note, time-stamped in early March, recording a call from spouse proxy declined further treatment discussion per patient request. Do not initiate additional contact. Per patient request. I read those 3 words maybe a dozen times, sitting in that parking garage with Saskia, watching me from the driver's seat, saying nothing. Lets me have the silence I needed. I'd never made that request. I'd never even had the conversation those words implied. A conversation where a frightened, exhausted patient tells his family he's done fighting, that he wants to be left alone with whatever time he has left. I'd never had the chance to have that conversation, because someone had scripted it for me and delivered it to a hospital system that had no reason to doubt a devoted spouse acting on her husband's behalf. She used my own voice against me, I said. Finally, mostly to myself. She didn't just lie to them. She told them I'd said something I never said. She put words in my mouth and used them to bury me. Saskia didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was small enough to still believe I could fix anything. We're going to make sure everyone knows exactly whose words those actually were. We stopped for coffee before the drive back. A small shop a few blocks from the medical school where Saskia said she needed 10 minutes to just breathe before getting back on the highway. I understood the request. I needed the same 10 minutes, though I doubt either of us could have explained exactly what we needed to breathe through the strange vertigo of having your entire understanding of a marriage rewritten in the space of a 20-minute meeting with a hospital records coordinator. I keep thinking about the anniversary dinner, Saskia said, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. She's been planning it for months, sending out invitations, picking the venue. How do you do that? How do you plan a party celebrating 38 years while you're actively lying to a hospital about your husband's cancer treatment? I don't know if I want to understand the answer to that. I keep trying to find a version where it makes sense, where she panicked, made one bad decision, and then couldn't figure out how to undo it. But that's not what this is it? This is 11 weeks of consistent choices. Every single day. She could have told you the truth every single day. She chose not to. I turned my own cup in my hands, watching the steam rise and dissipate, thinking about 38 years of small kindnesses that I was now being asked to view through an entirely different lens. Your mother has always been good at compartmentalizing. I used to think that was a strength. She could handle a dozen things at once without ever seeming overwhelmed. I'm starting to understand that skill differently now. Dad, Saskia reached across the table and took my hand. The way she had in the coordinator's office an hour earlier. None of this is because you weren't enough. Whatever she's doing, whatever reasons she's telling herself justify it, that's about her, not about you. I appreciated her saying it, even though I wasn't sure yet that I believed it. 38 years is a long time to build an identity around being someone's husband, and I hadn't yet had the time to understand who I was outside of that particular architecture. I would have that time eventually, more of it than I wanted. In the months that followed, but sitting in that Austin coffee shop, I only had the growing, cold certainty that I didn't know the woman I'd trusted with my life nearly as well as I'd believed. Before we left, Priya walked back out to the waiting area with a printed treatment recommendation, laying out exactly what Dell Medical would offer if I chose to transfer my care there instead of continuing to fight with Houston Methodist Records Department. There's no medical reason you need to stay with a system that's already shown this kind of breakdown in your care, she said, gently but plainly. Dr. Okafor here specializes in exactly your diagnosis. We could have you scheduled for a treatment planning consultation within the week. I thought about it on the walk back to the parking garage, weighing loyalty to Dr. Prescott, a man I'd trusted for over a decade, who'd caught the shadow on my lungs in the first place, against the practical wisdom of starting fresh somewhere. Marlene had no history, no contacts, no ability to intercept anything. In the end, I decided to keep Dr. Prescott. Not out of sentiment exactly, but because I'd already begun to understand that the fight ahead of me wasn't really about which hospital treated my cancer. It was about making sure the truth reached the right people at the right time. Dr. Prescott, once he understood what had happened, seemed like exactly the kind of ally that fight would require. We didn't talk much on the drive back to Houston. I remember watching the same ranch land scroll past in reverse, thinking about 11 weeks the way you think about a wound you've just discovered was bleeding the whole time you thought you were simply tired. 11 weeks, Saskia finally said, somewhere past the halfway point. That's how long you've been sick without treatment. That's not an accident, Dad. That's not a scheduling error. Someone had to make that phone call. Someone had to keep making it every time the hospital tried to reach you. Your mother. My mother. She said it flatly. Not as a question. The way you name something you've already accepted, even though accepting it costs you. Why would she do that? I didn't have an answer that made sense yet. I had suspicions I wasn't ready to say out loud in a moving car with my daughter's hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Suspicions about the beach house Corbin had asked me about, Marlene's increasing absences on weekday afternoons, about a woman I'd built a life with for 38 years who I was beginning to realize I might not know at all. I thought about Malcolm's question from his office. Has anything else felt off? I thought about how much I'd wanted to say no. I need you to promise me something, I told Saskia. As the Houston skyline started rising out of the haze ahead of us, don't confront her. Not yet. Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with. You want to just let her keep... I want to build a case she can't talk her way out of. If we go to her now with suspicions, she'll have an explanation ready. She's had 11 weeks to build one. I need proof, not accusations. Saskia was quiet for a long moment. And when she spoke again, her voice had steadied into something colder and more deliberate than the fear I'd heard in the parking lot 2 days earlier. Then let's get proof. I called Malcolm that evening from my study, door closed, and told him everything. The 11 weeks, the healthcare proxy's altered language, the co-ownership clause on the lease, the phone call to Dell Medical School that Priya had documented in their system. He listened without interrupting. The particular silence of a good attorney building a case in real time. This is bigger than a lease dispute, he said finally. This is healthcare fraud, potentially elder financial abuse, depending on how a jury weighs the timeline. And possibly attempted... He stopped himself, chose a gentler word than the one I suspected he'd started to reach for. This is serious, Otis. I want to bring in someone to help build a financial timeline, and I want you to start documenting everything from this point forward. Dates, conversations, anything that feels even slightly off. I did. For the next several weeks, I kept a small notebook in my jacket pocket, writing down times Marlene left the house without explanation. Mail that arrived opened before I saw it. A locksmith's van I noticed parked outside our house one afternoon when I came home early from Langley's. None of it, on its own, proved anything. Together. It started drawing an outline of a woman I no longer recognized, moving through the last months of a marriage she'd apparently already decided was over. The financial investigator Malcolm brought in. A soft-spoken woman named Nadine who specialized in tracing money through the kind of small, patient transfers that avoided triggering federal reporting thresholds. Called me 2 weeks into her work with a preliminary finding that I still remember word for word. Mr. Hayward, in the past 14 months, roughly $140,000 has moved out of joint accounts you and your wife hold, in increments consistently below the $10,000 reporting threshold. It's a pattern financial examiners call structuring. It's designed specifically to avoid detection. Where did it go? That's what I'm still tracing. Some of it went into a separate account she opened at a different bank 18 months ago. An account you're not listed on. I'll have more for you by the end of the month. I hung up the phone that afternoon and sat in my truck outside Langley's for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, trying to absorb the fact that my wife had been quietly bleeding our joint accounts for over a year, in amounts small enough to escape notice. While I'd been worrying about walk-in cooler temperatures and supplier contracts, entirely unaware that the ground beneath our marriage had already been sold out from under me in careful, deliberate installments. I met Nadine in person for the first time that Friday, in a small conference room above a title company where she kept her office. Stack of bank records organized into color-coded folders across the table between us. She was younger than I'd expected from her voice on the phone, maybe 40, with the particular unhurried thoroughness of someone who'd built a career on not missing details other people overlooked. "I want to show you something," she said, sliding a folder toward me. "This is the account she opened 18 months ago. Watch the deposit pattern." I looked at the numbers, watching the story they told without needing her to narrate it. Deposits of $8,500. $9,200, $8,800, each one arriving a few weeks apart, each one calculated. I now understood. To sit just under the $10,000 threshold that would have triggered automatic federal reporting. "She researched this," I said, mostly to myself. "This isn't panic. This is someone who looked up exactly how banking regulations work and built a system around avoiding them." That's my read as well. Structuring like this doesn't happen by accident. Someone either has financial sophistication themselves or access to someone who does. Nadine turned to another page. "There's also this, a payment, 11 months ago, to a document preparation service in Sugarland, $600. Described only as consulting fee on the account she controls. You think that's connected to the forged proxy? I can't prove it yet, but the timing lines up closely with when the additional language would have needed to be drafted and formatted to match your original document. I've requested records from the service directly. If they cooperate, we may have a direct line connecting the forgery to a specific transaction she authorized." I sat with that information for a long moment, looking at a folder full of numbers that amounted to a portrait of premeditation I hadn't been ready to see in full color until that afternoon. 11s of planning, 18 months of a hidden account, a consulting fee paid to forge a document that would let her claim ownership of something I'd spent 35 years building. Somewhere in that folder was the answer to a question I'd been avoiding since the lease amendment first surfaced. Not whether Marlene had done this, but how long she'd been capable of doing it while still sleeping beside me every night. Still kissing me goodbye each morning. Still performing a marriage she'd apparently already begun dismantling in careful, well-documented installments. Judge Morrison's reputation preceded her by the time Malcolm first mentioned bringing our case in front of her. Should it come to that. A former prosecutor who'd spent a decade in the Harris County DA's office before taking the bench. She had, according to Malcolm, a well-earned reputation for moving fast on cases involving elder abuse, and a low tolerance for defendants who tried to slow-walk discovery. "If this goes the way I think it's going to go," Malcolm told me, during one of our now weekly meetings at his office, "we're going to end up in front of her on an emergency basis. Probably more than once. I want you prepared for how quickly this can move once we file. Judges like Morrison don't give fraud cases the luxury of a slow docket. Not when there's an ongoing risk of assets disappearing." What does that mean for timing? It means once we pull the trigger on formal filings, things can happen within days rather than months. Emergency motions. Temporary restraining orders on accounts and property, hearings scheduled on an expedited basis. He tapped his pen against the legal pad in front of him. It also means we need our evidence airtight before we file anything. Judge Morrison doesn't suffer fraud claims that fall apart on cross-examination. If we go to her, we go with everything locked down. I appreciated the caution. even as some frustrated part of me wanted to move faster. Wanted the machinery of justice to match the urgency I felt every time I thought about the treatment time already lost. But I built 7 restaurants by understanding the difference between moving fast and moving recklessly. And I trusted Malcolm's instinct for which this situation required. "How long until we have enough?" I asked. Nadine thinks another few weeks on the financial side. The document examiner already has enough to testify to the forgery on the proxy. The real question is, timing around the anniversary dinner, whether we move before it, using the element of surprise, or after it, once you've had a chance to confront her privately first. I'd already made that decision, sitting in his office that afternoon, though I hadn't yet told him the specifics of what I was planning for that dinner. "After," I said. "I want one more chance to see what she does when she doesn't know how much I already know." Malcolm called an emergency meeting the week after Austin, bringing in Nadine to walk us both through the financial timeline she'd assembled. We sat around his conference table, with printouts spread between us, bank statements, the structured transfers, a copy of the deed search Nadine had run on properties in Marlene's name or associated with accounts she controlled. "There's a property under contract in Galveston," Nadine said, sliding a printout across the table. "Waterfront, listed at just under $600,000. Earnest money was deposited 3 weeks ago from the account she opened without you, the one that's received most of the structured transfers." I thought of Corbin's phone call, his questions about waterfront property values, his casual interest in numbers I hadn't understood the weight of at the time. My son knew about this house. Possibly. I can't say for certain what he knew and when. Only that the property exists and the money trail leads back to accounts your wife controls. Nadine's voice stayed carefully neutral. The voice of someone who dealt in documented fact rather than speculation. "What I can tell you is the timeline is tight. If she's under contract, closing is likely within the next month or 2. Once that money moves into real estate, it becomes significantly harder to recover in a settlement." Malcolm leaned forward. "This changes approach. We move for an emergency freeze on the accounts tied to this transaction. And we do it before she can close." "Otis, I know you wanted to wait until the anniversary dinner to make any of this public. I understand the reasoning. But if we wait past that, we may be fighting to recover a beach house that's already sold to someone else, with the proceeds moved somewhere even Nadine can't easily trace." I sat with that for a long moment, weighing the plan I'd already built against this new urgency. "The dinner is in 9 days. Then we file the freeze motion quietly tomorrow, under seal, so it doesn't tip her off before the party. The dinner still happens the way you planned it. But we protect the money first, regardless of how the confrontation goes." I agreed. And Malcolm filed the motion the next morning, a small procedural action that would later become one more piece of evidence in the case Celeste's boxes eventually completed proof that Marlene's plans for that beach house had been moving forward in real time, even as she hummed and tried on dresses for a party meant to celebrate 38 years she'd already privately decided to end. The anniversary dinner had been planned for months before any of this started, a tradition Marlene insisted on every 5 years. A proper celebration, rather than our usual quiet dinner at home. 38 years called for the private room at the Corinthian, she'd said back in January, before I knew what March would bring. 14 guests, mostly old friends from the restaurant world, and a few couples from our years in the same church congregation. I'd agreed to all of it back when agreeing cost me nothing. By the time June arrived, I understood enough to know I couldn't simply cancel the party without tipping my hand. Malk and I had spent 3 weeks building a case that depended on Marlene believing she still had the advantage of my ignorance. If I confronted her privately, she'd have time to destroy documents, move money, construct alibis. If I said nothing and let the anniversary dinner proceed as planned, she'd walk into that room still certain of her own success. I called Dr. Prescott's office 2 days before the dinner and asked for something I suspect no patient had ever requested of him before. I need you to call me at a specific time, I said. During a dinner, on speakerphone. If my phone happens to be set that way when you call. Dr. Prescott was quiet for a moment. Mr. Hayward, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. My wife has spent 11 weeks telling your hospital system that I decline treatment and want no contact. She's done this without my knowledge. I want her to hear, from you directly, in front of witnesses, that this isn't true. I want the record corrected, out loud, where it can't be quietly filed away. He agreed, eventually. Once I'd explained enough of the situation that he understood the medical urgency underneath my strange request, that this wasn't theater for its own sake, but the fastest way to force an honest accounting of 11 stolen weeks, in a setting where Marlene couldn't simply hang up or claim a bad connection. I spent those 2 days rehearsing calm the way I'd once rehearsed kitchen inspections, running through every version of what might happen at that table. I told Saskia what I was planning. I didn't tell Corbin. Not because I didn't trust him exactly, but because I no longer trusted what he might do with advance warning, given where his loyalties had recently seemed to sit. The morning of the dinner. Marlene hummed while she got dressed, trying on 3 different dresses before settling on the navy one I'd bought her 2 Christmases earlier. She looked happy in a way I hadn't seen in months. And watching her happiness, knowing what I knew, felt like standing at the edge of something I couldn't yet name. Grief? Maybe. For a version of my marriage that had probably stopped existing long before I noticed its absence. 38 years, she said, checking her reflection in the mirror. Can you believe it? No, I said, and meant it more than she understood. I really can't. Saskia arrived early to help me into my suit jacket, an old habit from years when my shoulder gave me trouble. Though tonight, neither of us mentioned that the habit had returned, for a different reason entirely. She checked my phone herself to make sure the speaker setting was correct. Her hands, steadier than mine had been all week. You don't have to do this, she said quietly, buttoning my top button the way she had 100 times since childhood, reaching up on her toes even now that she was a grown woman. We could go to the DA directly, skip the theater. I've thought about that. I keep coming back to the same thing she's spent 11 weeks controlling the story. Every version of this that reaches anyone official, she gets to shape first. Tonight. For the first time, the story reaches people before she can get to it. 14 witnesses. No time to prepare a version that isn't true. And if it doesn't work, if she talks her way out of it in front of everyone, then at least 14 people will have heard Dr. Prescott's actual words, in his actual voice, on the record, before she gets a chance to spin them into anything else. I looked at my daughter in the mirror beside me. Both of us dressed for a celebration that had already stopped being one. I need this to happen in a room I can't control the outcome of. I've spent 11 weeks being controlled, tonight. I'd rather take the risk than stay quiet. The Corinthians sat on the edge of River Oaks, a restaurant I'd eaten at a dozen times over the years without ever quite belonging to its particular Houston elegance. The kind of place built for anniversaries and retirements and the milestones people wanted photographed under good lighting. Marlene had chosen it specifically. She'd told me back in January, because it was where we'd gone for our 5th anniversary, back when neither of us could afford it, and had ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and called it a splurge anyway. I thought about that 5th anniversary while I dressed that evening 2 kids in their late 20s. Third 3 years less complicated than everything sitting on the other side of tonight's dinner. Sharing a single dessert because 2 seemed extravagant. I wondered whether Marlene remembered that night the same way I did, or whether her memory of it had already been rewritten by whatever calculus had led her, decades later, to a beach house and a man named Brent Gallagher and 11 weeks of silence she'd apparently found easier to maintain than honesty. The guest list read like a history of our marriage: the Hendrickses, whose son had been in Corbin's kindergarten class, the Alvarezes, who'd catered their own daughter's wedding using recipes I'd helped develop for Langley's 20 years earlier. 2 couples from Grace Community Church, where Marlene and I had sat in the same pew every Sunday for over 3 decades. 14 people who'd watched our marriage from the outside for most of its length, who believed, walking into that private room that evening, that they were there to celebrate something whole. Mal called me one final time before I left for the restaurant, confirming that the emergency freeze on Marlene's accounts had been formally entered that morning, sealed until further order. "Everything's in place on our end," he said. "Whatever happens tonight, the financial side is protected. This is your call now. Notice how you want the rest of it to unfold. I want her to hear the truth from someone she can't argue with. Everything else we handle through you afterward." "Understood. I'll have my phone on all evening in case anything moves faster than expected." He paused before hanging up. "For what it's worth, I think you're handling this with more grace than most people would manage in your position." I didn't feel graceful, standing in my closet 20 minutes later, choosing between 2 ties I hadn't worn in years. My hands steadier than my thoughts. I felt like a man about to detonate something he'd spent weeks carefully wiring, uncertain until the last possible second whether the wiring would hold. The private room at the Corinthian glowed with candlelight and the particular warmth of people who'd known each other for decades, raising glasses to a marriage they believed was still what it appeared to be. I sat at the head of the table with my phone in my jacket pocket, set to speaker, waiting. Marlene stood for the toast around 8:30. Glass raised, the room quieting around her practiced smile. She'd always been good at this. The performance of warmth, the timing of a pause for effect. I watched her the way you watch a magician you already know the trick to, waiting for the sleight of hand you can finally see clearly. 38 years, she began. And I have to say, marriage to Otis Hayward has taught me more about patience than I ever expected to need. Laughter rippled around the table, warm and complicit. He built an empire out of stubbornness and long hours, and somewhere along the way, he forgot how to slow down and enjoy any of it. Here's to my husband, even if he's become rather worthless lately. 14 guests laughed, the nervous kind of laughter people offer when they're not entirely sure a joke was meant kindly, but want to believe it was. I watched my son's face carefully across the table and saw him laugh too, a beat behind everyone else. The laugh of someone who'd decided long ago which parent's jokes he found funnier. My phone rang before the laughter fully died down. I let it ring twice, letting the sound settle into the room, and then I answered and set it on the table, speaker already engaged. "Mr. Hayward," Dr. Prescott's voice filled the private room, clear and unmistakable. "This is Dr. Prescott's office calling. I've been trying to coordinate your cancer treatment for 11 weeks now. Your family contact told us you'd declined care and requested no further contact, but given the urgency of your diagnosis, I wanted to reach you directly to confirm that's actually your wish." The table went silent in a way 14 people rarely manage all at once. My son stared at his plate, Marlene's face drained of every drop of color, the toast still half raised in her hand, the champagne catching candlelight in a way that suddenly looked obscene against what was happening around it. "Please continue. Dr. Prescott," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I want everyone to understand what you're referring to." He did, methodically and without malice, laying out 11 weeks of blocked calls. A family contact who'd repeatedly confirmed my refusal of treatment. A diagnosis that had gone from urgent to critical in the silence Marlene had constructed around it. I watched her while he spoke. I watched 38 years of careful performance collapse in real time. Watched old friends' faces shift from confusion to a dawning, horrified understanding. "Marlene," I said, when Dr. Prescott finished, "would you like to explain to our guests why the hospital believed I'd declined treatment for a cancer diagnosis I never knew I had?" She didn't answer. She set the champagne glass down with a hand that had started to shake, and for a long moment nobody in that private room said anything at all. the candles burning steadily over a table full of people recalculating everything they thought they knew about the marriage they'd just toasted. Patricia Hendricks, the wife of my longtime accountant and one of the 14 guests seated closest to us, was the first to break the silence.
Marlene,
She said, her voice careful but unmistakably horrified. Is that true Otis has cancer, and you told the hospital he didn't want treatment? Marlene's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. It's more complicated than that. Otis has always struggled with anxiety around medical decisions. I was only trying to manage the process so he wouldn't— 11 weeks, Marlene, I said. Dr. Prescott just told this entire table it's been 11 weeks. I never once discussed managing any process with you. I never knew there was a process happening at all. She looked around the table then, searching the faces of people she'd known for decades. Old friends whose expressions had shifted from polite confusion into something colder and more final. I watched her realize in real time that no explanation she could offer in that room was going to land the way she needed it to. 38 years of careful reputation building had just met 11 weeks of documented silence. And the math wasn't going to work out in her favor no matter how she tried to frame it. She left the table without another word, her heels sharp against the private room's hardwood floor. And I sat there, with 14 witnesses and a phone still warm from Dr. Prescott's call, understanding that whatever came next, I would never again have to wonder whether anyone believed me. If a moment like this has ever happened to you, finding out someone close to you had been managing the truth without your consent, I want to hear you about it. Drop a comment below and tell me how you found out and what you did next. And if this story has you gripped already, make sure you're subscribed. Because what happens after this dinner is only the beginning of how this family came apart and came back together. I drove home alone that night from the Corinthian, the private room still ringing in my ears with the particular silence that follows a public collapse. Saskia had offered to follow me home, and Corbin had left before I could say another word to him, his car pulling out of the parking lot fast enough that I wondered, watching his taillights disappear. Whether he was driving toward his mother or simply away from all of us, the house felt enormous that night, the way houses do after something inside them has fundamentally changed shape. I sat in my study with a glass of water I didn't drink, replaying the dinner in fragments. Marlene's toast, the laughter that followed it. Dr. Prescott's steady clinical voice cutting through 14 years of careful denial in under 2 minutes. I thought about the woman who'd written 38 years on a place card that afternoon, planning a celebration for a marriage she'd apparently already filed away as a liability to be managed rather than a life to be lived. My phone buzzed close to midnight. A text from Patricia Hendricks, the accountant's wife who'd first broken the silence at our table, Otis. I'm so sorry. If you need anything at all, please call. We had no idea. None of us had any idea. I believed her. That was the strange mercy of it. Sitting alone in my study at midnight, understanding that the people in that room hadn't been complicit in Marlene's deception, only unwitting witnesses to its unraveling. The same as I'd been an unwitting subject of it for 11 weeks. I wrote back a short reply, thanking her, and set the phone down, and sat with the particular loneliness of a man whose marriage had just ended in front of everyone he knew except the one person he most needed to understand it, himself. Still catching up to what the last 11 weeks had actually meant. Nobody finished their entrees. The restaurant staff cleared plates with the particular efficiency of people trained to disappear during a crisis. And within 20 minutes, the private room had emptied of everyone except Marlene, myself, and the wreckage of a party that would be talked about at every dinner table those 14 guests sat at for years afterward. Marlene found her voice eventually. In the parking lot, her hand gripping my arm hard enough to leave marks. You did that on purpose. You humiliated me in front of everyone we know. You hid a cancer diagnosis from me for 11 weeks, I said. I think humiliation is the least of what you should be worried about tonight. I was protecting you. You get so anxious about medical things. I didn't want you spiraling before we even knew Marlene. I said her name the way you'd stop a child mid-lie. Not unkindly, just final. I have documentation. Malcolm has documentation. The healthcare proxy you altered. The lease amendment you filed using authority you were never given. 11 weeks of calls you blocked. This isn't a conversation where you get to choose which version of events survives. She stopped talking. That silence told me more than anything she might have said, a woman calculating. In real time, how much I actually knew versus how much I was bluffing. I let her sit with that uncertainty. I drove myself home that night, leaving her standing in the Corinthians parking lot in the navy dress I'd bought her. And I didn't look back to see what she did next. The fallout moved faster than I expected. By Monday morning, 3 of the 14 guests had called to check on me. Careful and awkward, clearly having spent the weekend processing what they'd witnessed. By Wednesday, Marlene's closest friend from the garden club had reportedly told her, in no uncertain terms, that she needed to get her affairs in order before people stopped returning her calls altogether. Houston's a big city, but the circles we moved in were small enough that 11 weeks of secrecy unraveled into gossip within days. Corbin called me that Thursday, his voice carrying an edge I didn't recognize. Not concern, exactly, but something more like irritation, as if I'd created an inconvenience rather than survived one. Dad, was that necessary, doing that at the dinner? In front of everyone. Was it necessary for your mother to spend 11 weeks lying to a hospital about my wishes? I'm not saying what she did was right. I'm saying you could have handled it privately. I tried privately, Corbin, for 11 weeks. I didn't even know there was anything to handle. I let that sit for a moment. Where were you? These past few months, did you notice anything strange about your mother's behavior? Did you ask her a single question about why I seemed sick and no one could tell you what the doctor said? He didn't have an answer. The silence on his end of the line told me everything his words hadn't. And I understood. Standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, that I'd already lost something with my son. That no amount of explaining 11 weeks of fraud was going to recover quickly, if at all. I went back to Langley's the next morning, earlier than usual, needing the particular grounding that came from standing in a kitchen before the rest of the world woke up. Wallace found me there around 6, going through invoices I didn't actually need to review. And he set down 2 cups of coffee without asking whether I wanted company. Whole city's talking about the dinner, he said, not unkindly. Figured you'd rather hear it from me than from a customer, asking nosy questions over the pass. I appreciate that. For what it's worth, Otis, whatever's coming next, this kitchen's still yours. Whatever happens with the house, with her, with any of it. 35 years. This place has been the one thing that never let you down. He nodded toward the dining room beyond the kitchen doors. Empty now. Chairs still up on tables before the morning crew arrived to set them down. 7 restaurants don't run themselves because a marriage fell apart. People are going to need feeding regardless. He was right. In the specific way that steady, unglamorous truths are usually right. I spent that morning walking through every station in the kitchen, checking temperatures, tasting sauces, doing the small, ordinary work that had built my life before any of this, and finding in it a kind of anchor I hadn't expected to need so badly. Marlene had taken so much already, and was fighting to take more of my money than she deserved. But she hadn't touched this particular satisfaction of a well-run kitchen at 6 in the morning. The smell of coffee and searing meat. The quiet dignity of work done well, regardless of what was falling apart in the rest of your life. Malcolm's emergency freeze motion hit Marlene's accounts that same week. And with it, the Galveston property fell through. The sellers unwilling to wait out a legal dispute over the earnest money's source. I learned this secondhand, through Nadine's updates rather than through Marlene herself, who had stopped speaking to me directly, except through Patricia Drummond's office. But I learned something else that week, too. something that told me more about my son than any conversation we'd had in months. Corbin called Nadine's office directly. Apparently, trying to get information about the frozen accounts, not concern for his mother's legal situation, according to the message Nadine relayed to me. But specific questions about whether the beach house deal could still close if he personally guaranteed the earnest money instead. I sat with that piece of information for a long time after Nadine told me, turning over, trying to find a version of my son in it that I could still recognize as the boy who'd worked the line at Langley's 2 summers in a row. Quick-handed and eager to please, I couldn't find him. What I found instead was a 31-year-old man offering to personally underwrite his mother's real estate deal with a lover I hadn't even confirmed existed yet. Weeks after learning his father had been left to discover a cancer diagnosis 11 weeks late. I didn't call him about it. I let Malcolm's investigator's note sit in the file. One more data point in a case I was no longer building against Marlene alone. Saskia came by that evening, having heard about the frozen accounts through the same small world grapevine that had carried news of the anniversary dinner across half of Houston. She found me on the back porch, the cicadas already loud in the summer dark, a glass of tea sweating on the table beside me. "I heard about the Galveston deal falling through," she said, settling into the chair beside mine. "Good. She doesn't deserve a beach house paid for with money she stole from you. Your brother tried to save it, offered to guarantee the earnest money himself." Saskia went quiet for a long moment, and in the dim porch light I watched something settle in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a confirmation of something she'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to say out loud. "I keep hoping he'll surprise me. Keep hoping there's a version of this where he wakes up and realizes what Mom actually did to you. But he keeps making it worse instead. He's still your brother." "I know. That's what makes it harder, not easier." She wrapped both hands around her glass, staring out at the yard where our old swing sets still stood, rusted now, unused for over 2 decades, but never quite gotten around to removing. I used to think Corbin and I just wanted different things out of life. He wanted the deals and the numbers, I wanted the kitchen and the people. I didn't think it meant we'd end up on opposite sides of something like this. I didn't have comfort to offer her that evening. Sitting together in the dark with cicadas filling the silence between us, some things, I was learning, didn't resolve into comfort. They simply had to be carried. The way Saskia and I were both learning to carry the shape of a family that had split cleanly in two, with neither of us entirely sure yet how much of it could ever be put back together. I filed for legal separation that Friday. Standing in Malcolm's office while he walked me through paperwork I'd never imagined needing after 38 years. It felt less like an ending and more like finally naming something that had already happened months earlier. Back in March, when Marlene had picked up a phone and decided my life was hers to manage without my consent. The separation was a formality. The marriage, I understood now, had ended the moment she'd made that first call. Whether either of us had said so out loud or not. Marlene moved out of our house the following week. Into a rental Malcolm's investigator traced back to money from that same structured account. The one I wasn't listed on. The one Nadine had flagged weeks earlier. She took clothes, some furniture from the guest room, and a silence that felt, walking through our suddenly half-empty house that evening, like the loudest thing I'd heard in months. I stood in what used to be our bedroom and realized I didn't feel the grief I'd expected. I felt something closer to relief. The specific relief of finally understanding a shape you'd been squinting at for weeks. I spent that first weekend alone rearranging furniture I hadn't touched in years. Not out of any grand emotional statement, but simply because I could, because for the first time in 38 years, every decision in that house belonged entirely to me. I moved my reading chair from the corner where it had always deferred to Marlene's preferred arrangement, into the spot by the window where the morning light actually reached it. Small thing. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. 6 in that repositioned chair that first Sunday morning, with coffee and sunlight and a silence that no longer felt like absence, but like space finally being returned to its rightful owner. I met with Malcolm the following Monday, laying out everything that had happened since our last conversation, the anniversary dinner. Marlene's reaction in the parking lot, the calls from concerned friends, Corbin's strange defensiveness on her behalf. Malcolm listened with his usual careful attention, taking notes in the small, precise handwriting I'd come to associate with problems getting solved. "We have a strong outline," he said when I'd finished. "The altered proxy, the lease amendment, the pattern of blocked medical communication. But outline isn't evidence. Not the kind that survives a courtroom. We need documentation with dates and details, something that shows intent, not just outcome. Right now." A good attorney on her side could argue confusion, miscommunication, an overwhelmed spouse making mistakes under stress. She wasn't confused. She was thorough. "I believe you, but belief isn't proof. We need something concrete, records, correspondence, anything that shows she knew what she was doing and did it anyway." I didn't have that yet. Not in any form a courtroom would respect. I had a notebook full of suspicious absences and unexplained mail, a records coordinator in Austin who could confirm the blocked calls, and a diagnosis far more advanced than it needed to be. It felt driving home from Malcolm's office that afternoon, like standing at the base of a mountain I wasn't sure I had the strength left to climb. Not with treatment still ahead of me. Not with a family fracturing in slow motion around a truth half the people in it didn't want to fully see. I didn't know yet that the proof I needed had already been collecting itself for months. Quietly, in a series of boxes under a desk, 6 years' worth of small talk away from where I sat every day. I didn't know that Celeste Blackwell had been photocopying intercepted mail since February, building a case of her own out of nothing but conscience and a father's death she hadn't been able to prevent the last time she'd watched an elderly man's finances disappear into someone else's hands. I began treatment that week regardless, unwilling to lose any more time than Marlene had already stolen. Dr. Prescott started me on an aggressive protocol, and I spent that first infusion sitting in a recliner at Texas Medical Center thinking, not about Marlene, not about the lease or the proxy or the structured accounts, but about the 11 weeks themselves. About what those weeks might have meant for my prognosis if they'd been spent fighting instead of being quietly erased by someone I'd trusted with everything. Dr. Prescott didn't offer false comfort about that lost time. He simply said we'd fight as hard as the calendar allowed us to now, and that hard work in the present couldn't undo the past, only outrun whatever of it still remained ahead of us. Saskia sat with me through that first infusion, reading a paperback she wasn't really reading. And somewhere in that quiet hospital room, I found myself grateful in a way that had nothing to do with Marlene at all. Grateful for a daughter who'd emptied her savings without hesitation. Grateful for a legal team building a case out of structured accounts and forged proxies. Grateful even for the strange clarity that betrayal sometimes hands you, stripping away every polite assumption you'd been living under until only the true shape of the people around you remains visible. Wallace visited during my second infusion that week, standing awkwardly by the door with a container of soup he'd made himself, embarrassed by the gesture but unwilling to arrive empty-handed. "Figured hospital coffee's terrible," he said, setting it on the tray table. "Restaurant business. You take care of your own." I thought about that phrase for a long time after he left. You take care of your own, turning it over against everything Marlene had done, against Corbin's silence, against the particular loneliness of discovering that the family you'd built by blood had failed you in ways the family you'd built by choice, by 6 years of small talk and shared shifts, never would have allowed. It was a small kindness, a container of soup from a man who owed me nothing beyond a paycheck. But it landed with a weight that surprised me, sitting there with chemotherapy dripping steadily into my arm, beginning to understand that everything Marlene had stolen from me had also, somehow, revealed exactly who deserved to be trusted with whatever years I had left. I didn't know it yet. Sitting in that recliner, with Wallace's soup going cold on the tray table beside a paperback Saskia still wasn't really reading. But the 11 weeks Marlene had stolen were about to become the very thing that convicted her every blocked call. Every altered document, every quiet lie building toward a reckoning that had already begun taking shape in 3 cardboard boxes I hadn't seen yet. Sitting under a desk, 6 years of small talk away from where I was about to walk back into my own life. I found out how far that clarity extended on a quiet Tuesday morning, roughly 2 weeks after the anniversary dinner, when Celeste finally asked to see me and Malcolm together, ready at last to share what she'd been quietly building toward for months. Celeste Blackwell arrived at Malcolm's office carrying 3 document boxes and the expression of someone who'd been holding a secret too long. I'd walked past her desk every day for 6 years, traded small talk about weekend plans and restaurant specials, never knowing she'd become the person who would hand me back my life. Malcolm stood when she entered, already sensing this was more than a courtesy visit. She set the boxes on the conference table with a deliberate care that made them seem heavier than they were. "Mr. Hayward," she said, voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "I need to show you something I've been keeping." I glanced at Malcolm, who gave a slight nod. "What is it, Celeste?" She opened the first box, revealing stacks of documents organized with the precision of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. "She told me to keep certain mail from reaching you. I knew it wasn't right, so I copied everything before filing it away." Malcolm moved closer, pulling out a folder. Inside were medical records, my pathology report from March, the one I'd never seen. A sticky note in Celeste's handwriting. Intercepted 3/5/25 per M. Hayward instruction. "You documented every intercept?" Malcolm asked, his attorney's mind already racing ahead to what this meant. 4 months of mail, Celeste said. Every piece, with dates, times, and her written instructions. She gestured to the other boxes. Bank statements she didn't want you to see. Legal notices from Houston Methodist. The healthcare proxy, authorization, I kept a copy of. The one she had you sign, and the one she filed with the hospital. They're not the same document. My hands went cold. I'd spent weeks building a case, and here was someone who'd been building it alongside me without my knowledge. "Why?" I asked. "Why risk this?" Celeste met my eyes for the first time. "Because my father died alone in a nursing home, while his second wife emptied his accounts. I watched it happen. And I didn't know enough to stop it." Her voice cracked slightly. "I wasn't going to watch it happen again." She'd worked for us for 6 years. I didn't even know her last name until she became my witness. Malcolm spent the next hour going through the boxes, pulling out documents and cross-referencing them with the timeline we'd already built. Every piece of mail Marlene had intercepted. Celeste had copied. Every instruction to hold this or file that away had been preserved in Celeste's neat handwriting. "This is admissible," Malcolm said quietly, holding up a hospital notice about appointment scheduling that had been diverted. She documented the crime as it was happening. "I didn't know what else to do," Celeste admitted. After the anniversary dinner, after everyone found out, I realized I had evidence that could help. I should have come forward sooner. "You came forward," I interrupted. "That's what matters." Malcolm was already on his phone, texting his paralegal. "We can file an emergency motion by end of day. The lease renewal is in 2 days. If we can prove Marlene obtained that co-ownership clause through fraud, can we?" I asked. He held up a document from the second box. "This is the healthcare proxy she had you sign in 2018, when you were in the hospital recovering from surgery. And this," he pulled another sheet, "is the lease amendment she filed 3 days later, using power of attorney you never explicitly granted for business contracts." I remembered that hospitalization. Kidney stones, surgery, a week of recovery. Marlene had brought me papers to sign. Said it was just updates to our insurance beneficiaries. I'd been on pain medication, trusting my wife of 30-plus years. How many people had Marlene underestimated while building her perfect plan? She'd assumed Celeste was just a clerk who'd follow orders. She'd assumed I'd stay sick or die before discovering the truth. She'd assumed Saskia would stay silent. Corbin would stay loyal, and the system would let her steal without consequence. She'd been wrong about all of it. Malcolm made 3 calls that afternoon. First to the courthouse, filing the emergency motion. Second to Nadine, asking her to pull the financial records showing when Marlene had started planning the beach house purchase. Third to a handwriting expert who could testify that the healthcare proxy authorization for business contracts had been added after I'd signed. The judge will want to see evidence that the proxy was fraudulent or exceeded its scope, Malcolm explained. We have both. The document was forged, signature authenticated, but authorization language added later. And even if it had been legitimate for medical decisions, using it to restructure a business lease without your knowledge constitutes fraud. How long until we know? Hearings tomorrow morning. Judge Morrison moves fast on elder abuse cases. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the lease I'd signed 40 years ago when I opened the first restaurant. It had been a promise to build something lasting, to create jobs, to serve the community. Marlene had turned that promise into a trap, inserting clauses that would let her claim ownership of everything I'd built. But fraud unravels. That's what Malcolm kept saying. Once you prove the foundation was built on lies, the entire structure falls. The judge signed the order the next morning. Malcolm called at 10:47 a.m., and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice before he said a word. The healthcare proxy she forged gave her power of attorney in 2018, he said. Every contract she signed during your recovery is voidable, including the lease clause. Judge signed the order this morning. The restaurant is yours, just yours. The lease I'd signed 40 years ago had been a promise. Today, it became proof. Proof that I'd built something real, something that couldn't be stolen by forged signatures and intercepted mail. Malcolm filed the restructured lease with the county that afternoon, Langley's main restaurant. Sole proprietor Otis Hayward. No co-ownership clause. No hidden traps. No claims from a fraudulent proxy. The empire I built over 35 years was finally mine alone. With the business secure, Malcolm turned to the harder battle, making Marlene pay for what she'd taken. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following week at Harris County Courthouse, and I spent the days between mentally preparing for the last time I'd have to be in the same room with her. Malcolm laid the settlement terms on the conference table across from Marlene's attorney. 75% of recovered assets to me, full business control, and the alternative felony charges for healthcare fraud and elder abuse. Marlene sat 3 chairs down, dressed in a navy suit I'd bought her 2 Christmases ago. She wouldn't look at me. Her attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Patricia Drummond, reviewed the terms with the expression of someone who'd already advised her client to take the deal. My client disputes the characterization of fraud, Patricia began. Malcolm cut her off. Healthcare fraud, elder financial abuse, and our office has flagged the HIPAA and structuring elements for federal referral. Combined sentencing exposure 8 to 15 years. He slid a legal brief across the table. The DA's office has already reviewed the evidence. They're prepared to file criminal charges if we don't reach settlement today. I watched Marlene's face go pale. She'd spent months planning my death, but she'd never planned for prison. The settlement is generous given the circumstances, Malcolm continued. Mrs. Hayward receives the beach house equity and $200,000. Mr. Hayward retains the 7 restaurants, the primary residence, and $2.1 million in recovered assets. As for what she took, $680,000 of the $900,000 has already been recovered from accounts she hadn't yet moved. How much is justice worth when you can quantify it in recovered dollars and signed admissions? I'd spent weeks trying to calculate it. The 11 weeks of delayed treatment. The fear I'd felt when I couldn't get my own medical records. The moment I realized my wife had been planning my death while I slept beside her. None of that fit neatly into a settlement agreement. But the look on Marlene's face when she realized she was going to lose almost everything that had value. "There's one additional term," I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting started. "I want it in writing that she admits the fraud. Every word." Patricia glanced at Marlene, who gave a tight nod. "My client will accept the settlement as written," Patricia said. The signing took 20 minutes. Marlene's hand shook when she put pen to paper. Her signature nothing like the confident scrawl she'd used to forge documents in my name. When she reached the admission of fraud section, she paused so long I thought she might refuse. But prison is a powerful motivator. She signed. I didn't say a word to her. Didn't acknowledge her presence beyond what the legal proceedings required. She'd stopped being my wife the moment she intercepted my cancer diagnosis. Now she was just a woman who'd tried to steal my life and failed. The real work came later, back at the restaurant office, where I'd spent 35 years building something I thought would be a family legacy. Saskia arrived at 2 o'clock, confused by my request for a meeting. I had the documents already prepared. Ownership transfer papers, updated articles of incorporation, a cashier's check, 65% ownership to Saskia Hayward, effective immediately, I said, signing the first page and sliding it across my desk. She stared at the papers like they might bite her. "Dad, what is this? You're the new majority owner. I'm keeping 35% and staying on as advisor, but the business is yours. You've earned it." I didn't do this for the business, I know. I slid the check across next. $15,000. The $9,000 you took from your 401k, plus the penalties, fees, and interest you lost. Dad, you don't have to repay the loan. You paid $9,000 out of pocket to save my life. I'm paying you back with interest. Saskia's eyes filled with tears. But she didn't argue further. She understood what I was doing, rewarding loyalty, marking who had stood with me and who had stood against me. "What about Corbin?" she asked quietly. "Corbin is removed from all company positions effective today. I've also updated my will. He's no longer in it." The words hung in the air between us. Saskia knew what her brother had done. The questions he'd asked about the beach house value while I fought for my life. But he was still her brother, and I could see the conflict in her face. Signing Corbin out of the will hurt less than I'd expected. He'd already chosen his inheritance. A beach house he'd never see. "He's going to call you," Saskia warned. "Probably. What will you say?" "Nothing." I looked at my daughter. This woman who'd drained her retirement savings without hesitation, who'd driven me to Austin and held my hand in the waiting room. Family isn't blood. It's who shows up when the blood work comes back wrong. She left with the ownership documents and the check, hugging me longer than usual before walking out. I sat alone in the office where I'd made 1,000 decisions over 3 decades, looking at the updated will on my desk. Saskia Hayward, primary beneficiary. The restaurants, the house, the recovered assets all going to the person who'd actually tried to save me. My phone buzzed at 6:47. Corbin's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again at 8:15. Same name, same decision. He wanted to explain, probably. Wanted to say he didn't know how serious it was. That he'd been misled by his mother. That he deserved another chance. All the things people say when they realize they've bet on the wrong horse and lost. But I remembered sitting in that empty restaurant, asking him about the beach house. I remembered his question about waterfront property, about what it was worth. Not once had he asked if I was dying. A part of me wanted to pick up, to hear him say he was sorry and mean it. But I'd learned the hard way that some silences protect you better than any explanation could. The silence I gave Corbin was easier than I expected. Once you've drawn the line between who stayed and who left, the decision makes itself. I had bigger things to focus on, like staying alive long enough to enjoy what I'd fought to keep. Dr. Prescott slid the scan report across the desk with the kind of smile oncologists reserve for words like remission. And I realized I was holding the most important document of my life. No evidence of disease. No evidence of disease, he said, repeating the words that were already burning into my memory. The treatment worked. You're clear. I stared at the report, at the technical language that translated to a simple truth: I wasn't dying. Not today. Not from this. The cancer that Marlene had tried to hide from me, the diagnosis she'd intercepted and buried, was gone. Even with the 11 weeks lost, I asked, even with that, you're here. You fought for it. I thought about those 11 weeks. March to May. Coughing through nights while Marlene slept beside me, planning my funeral and her escape. The biopsy results she'd intercepted. The treatment coordination she'd blocked. The medical fraud that could have killed me if Saskia hadn't intervened. 11 weeks. She stole 11 weeks. And somehow I still got my life back. Dr. Prescott walked me through the follow-up schedule scans every 3 months for the first year. Then every 6 months. Annual checkups after that. Monitoring. Vigilance, but not treatment. I was on the other side of it now. I left Texas Medical Center with the scan report in a manila folder. Walked to my car through humid July heat, and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. I'd spent months fighting for my health, my business, my life, and I'd won. The victory didn't taste the way I'd expected. There was relief, profound and overwhelming. But there was also something quieter, sadder. Malcolm had told me the rest of it over coffee the week before. The details he'd learned through his network of attorneys and investigators. Marlene was living in a studio apartment in Pearland, the settlement money already diminishing. The friends who'd attended our anniversary dinner had stopped calling after the public exposure. She was alone, and Brent Gallagher, the man she'd given up 38 years for, had never contacted her after that night. The investigation Malcolm ordered had revealed what Nadine had suspected all along. Brent had another relationship running simultaneously. Possibly another target. When the fraud came to light, and Marlene became legally and socially toxic, he'd simply moved on to the next woman. She wasn't special to him. She was just another mark in a pattern he'd been running for years. She gave up 38 years for a con man who never wanted her. Is there a word for when karma doesn't feel satisfying? Just sad. I'd spent weeks being angry, and I'd earned that anger. But somewhere in the months of treatment and legal battles and rebuilding, the anger had burned itself out. What remained was a kind of distant pity for a woman who'd destroyed everything real in pursuit of something that was never there. She'd had a husband who loved her, children who respected her, a business that provided security, a life that most people would have been grateful for. And she'd traded all of it for a beach house and a man who saw her as just another transaction. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd called me worthless, calculated that I was worth more dead than alive, and made her plans accordingly. But in the end, she was the one who'd miscalculated value. I drove home as the sun started setting, painting Houston's sky in shades of orange and pink. The house was quiet when I arrived. Just mine now. No longer a place where secrets hid in intercepted mail and forged signatures. I made coffee, carried it out to the porch, and settled into the chair I'd sat in 1,000 times before. My phone rang at 7. Saskia, right on schedule. We'd fallen into a routine over the past months. She called every evening around this time, checking in the way I used to check in on her when she was in college. "How was the appointment?" she asked before I could say hello. What did Dr. Prescott say? Clear. I'm clear, honey. I heard her exhale, long and shaky. Thank God. Dad, I'm so proud of you. I'm proud of you too. I took a sip of coffee, warm and bitter in the cooling evening air. None of this works without you. I'll see you tomorrow at the restaurant, she said. We can celebrate properly. Sounds good. Saskia's voice faded as she hung up, leaving making coffee and warm July air. The cicadas were starting their evening chorus. The familiar Houston soundtrack I'd heard every summer for 67 years. Worth isn't measured in dollars or decades. It's measured in who stays when the diagnosis comes back. I thought about the anniversary dinner. That night that felt like another lifetime now. Marlene's practiced toast about growth and honesty. The guests raising their glasses. The phone call that had changed everything. I thought about her calling me worthless. The casual cruelty, delivered with a smile for the benefit of witnesses. The anniversary dinner felt like another lifetime. Marlene's toast, the guests, the phone that changed everything. She said I wasn't worth it. She was right. Just aimed at the wrong person in that room. And to you, listening to my story, remember this. Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. I spent 38 years believing that love and loyalty were automatic. That if you built something together, you'd protect it together. I wrong. I ignored warning signs because I wanted to believe the best. Don't make my mistake. Pay attention when someone's actions don't match their words, especially when your health and future are at stake. This isn't just a revenge story about payback. It's a story about survival and self-protection. When I discovered what Marlene had done, I could have let anger destroy me. Instead, I chose to fight strategically, to document everything, to trust the people who actually showed up. That's the real lesson from this revenge story. It's not about spite, it's about justice and protecting yourself from those who would exploit your trust. I believe God put me through this trial to teach me the difference between family by blood and family by choice. The people who saved my life weren't the ones who shared my name. If this revenge story touched you, or if you've lived through something similar, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done in my position? Please share this story with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more real stories about family, betrayal, and finding strength. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. One last reminder. While the core truth of this story is real, some details have been fictionalized for privacy and storytelling